The major global issue at the moment is the overpopulation, the dense population of the world, because it creates a number of other problems concerning nutrition, concerning the health aspects, and many other aspects of our daily life. Also, this type of overpopulation is unevenly distributed throughout the world. There are many parts of the world which are much too densely populated at this moment, and the problems becoming more and more evident. Energy supply, water supply, and many other aspects linked to it as well. The major point will be education of people, advocacy that it is necessary to limit the number of children. And in addition, there's also, of course, a need for stricter birth control in order to limit the numbers, the growth of the population. And I know how difficult it is to achieve, particularly watching the situation in the Republic of China in these days. There's indeed introduced a very strict and stringent restriction at the number of children. But I guess we have to learn from the situation right now, and we have to be aware of the problems which are going to arise in the future in order to cope with this problem. So without any type of, how should I say, selective type of birth control, it will be very difficult to overcome or to create situations which will not in the end up in war and many other aggressive actions. Vaccines against the agents which we found, the papillomaviruses, they are still exceedingly expensive and cannot be afforded in many parts of the developing world. I know that the two companies producing vaccines are willing, at least in part, to reduce these prices. But even, let's say, a price of a doses of $20 or so is much too high for many of these countries. My personal view is that probably the situation is not going to change before some competitive companies come up within the developing world. And I know that there are some activities going on, for instance, in Hyderabad, in India, also in mainland China, and apparently also to some degree in Argentina. Particularly the company in Hyderabad seems to be relatively far advanced, and hopefully they will sell the vaccine to an affordable price, but I'm not sure yet of the price policy which they have there, but I presume it will be much cheaper than the present ones, and that will force the other companies also to reduce their prices. So in a way, I foresee that there will be protective measurements be available, although presently the vaccine protects against 70 to 80% of cervical cancers. There are now other vaccines in preparation, which contain either 8 or 9 types of the same viruses causing anogenital cancers. I guess they probably will come into or reach the market, as the companies say, within a foreseeable period of time of a couple of years. It will be quite important that even then the prices need to be drastically reduced. Theoretically, we have right now, by vaccination against hepatitis B virus and also against the high-risk papillomaviruses, a chance to reduce the cancers in females globally, if the vaccines are globally applied, by about 12 to 15%. It still requires a global action to do so. In males, it's only 4 to 5% against mainly hepatitis B viruses. The papillomaviruses play a minor role in males in cancer development. So I think we need to do much more. And what would be important, of course, and is another aspect, is to try to see whether other cancers, which presently are not yet linked to infections, whether they have an infectious origin. That's one of the major issues of our own work today. And because there exists some epidemiological evidence for certain types of cancer which are widely spread in the population, that they might be linked to infections, to search for those agents, hopefully to develop preventive measurements to at least devise something which permits an early diagnosis of patients at risk, and finally also to provide, hopefully, a targeted chemotherapy, if that is possible at all. The price of the industry is part of the problem. It's not the only problem. I think the other problem is really the knowledge of health ministries, of health officials, and even of medical doctors about the benefits of the vaccines. And you find amazingly many, if you travel a lot and talk to physicians in particular, you find amazingly many who are not really familiar with the issue. And this is something which needs to be changed. So it's a better training at the universities already. It's a better continuous education of medically trained people, but it's not only the medically trained people, but also the health officials, in particular also the health ministries, which need to be educated to some degree in this field. And of course the price is the other issue, but that needs to be reduced indeed in order to facilitate the vaccination in the future. There are a couple of European countries, for instance, who can relatively readily afford the prices of the vaccines already right now, and yet the vaccination rate of the eligible groups, these are girls and also boys, prior to the onset of sexual maturity and activity, which show vast differences in the acceptance rate. For instance, I know in Britain the rate is relatively high, it's around 80% or so. In Austria, for instance, it's only 5% of the respective groups. In Germany, we have something like, I do not know accurately the figures, but it should be between 35 and 40% of the eligible groups again. So we still have vast differences even within the European Union in acceptance of these vaccines. And in some of these countries, the health insurances don't cover the vaccine, like in Austria. In others they do. In Germany, for instance, they do. And I believe in Britain it's mainly sponsored by the government. So the possibilities exist, but yet the knowledge about the vaccination is still relatively limited, particularly from the medical field into governments and into health officials. Well, my prediction is particularly good for prevention. I mean, there we have some chances to develop something, of course, which will not help the elderly people who are already infected or carry agents or have modified cells within their bodies. As far as therapy is concerned, as you certainly know, there are substantial advances which have been made during the past decades in the treatment of specific types of cancers. Leukemias, Hodgkin's disease, and a couple of others are good examples right now that a lot can be reached. And even breast cancer, more than 50% of the women survive now more than 5 years. But we still have a couple of cancers where we do not know very much how to handle them. Take, for instance, brain tumors, glioma specifically, or take even lung cancer, if it's not discovered very early, or pancreatic cancer is one of the worst examples, really, where at most 1 of 5%, up to 5% may survive 1 year after the diagnosis has been found. So I hate from time to time to hear my own colleagues saying that we advanced so much, so enormously in cancer research, and many things can be done right now. They should rather look into what has not been achieved in the meantime, because we have an enormous amount of work in front of us. I'm sure it can be done, but it takes time, it takes money, and it takes enormous efforts and also ingenuity. It was not really a novel idea, because the first cancers linked to infections came up 1908 and 1911 already, so about 100 years ago, or even more than 100 years ago. But these were all cancers in animals, particularly since the 1950s, when Ludwig Ross in New York found out that leukemias and lymphomas in mice due to virus infections, this provided for a certain period of time a boost also to search for similar agents in humans. But it took a relatively long time before the first successful agents were found. By the way, the very first human tumor virus was discovered here in Britain, at that time in Bristol, by Tony Epstein and his colleagues, the Epstein-Barr virus, which is still not fully understood in its mechanistic aspects, how it causes cancer. To some degree it is, but not fully. But this was the first interesting and encouraging example. And I was lucky myself to work in a place in Philadelphia, which started already 1 year after Tony Epstein discovered this agent with the virus, and we worked on the transformation of human cells by the virus and so on. Quite a number of aspects were handled during this period of time. And even upon my return to Germany, I worked for a while on this agent. As far as my personal view of the whole story is concerned, I started it as a student, because at that time I became aware of the existence of lysogeny in bacteria and phages, which means bacteria which pick up the genomes of bacteriophages, change their properties, and may become, for instance, they may produce toxins, where apparently the uptake of a plasmid, probably originating initially from a virus in diphtheria or in cholera, indeed created the toxic strains of the respective agents. So I thought at that time, if this is a case for bacteria, that they modify their properties by taking up foreign genes, couldn't be cancer a similar situation, that uptake of a viral genome would lead to a modification of the properties of the cell and even to invasive growth. It was in a way a somewhat straightforward, but also at the same time somewhat naive idea, because over the years we learned, of course, that the mechanism by which viruses transform human cells is rather complicated. It's not simply the uptake of the viral genome, but it requires also the modification of specific host cell genes in the infected cell. And this was a reason for the very long latency periods which are observed, usually in the order of decades, sometimes up to 6 decades, or even occasionally longer than that, and only in exceptional cases during very short periods of several years only. So in a way, the mechanism is now much better understood. The initial reluctance to accept viruses as human carcinogens resulted from the fact that you could not backdate it to the initial event of the infection, and it was difficult to understand how an agent after 10, 20, 30 or 40 years is eventually able to create cancer or to establish cancer. But today we know that this is really an indication of the additional changes which have to take place in spite of those cases where the virus is a necessary factor for cancer development, an essential one basically, but it's not a sufficient factor, because these additional modifications of host cell genes are always mandatory in order to achieve malignant growth. The only thing which I can say, particularly to young people who are starting their careers, really to look hard for an interesting problem, to see that they have a chance to develop some ideas more or less independently, to think a little bit anti-dogmatic, not to stay. We have in medicine too many dogmas, and to be persistent also in the efforts to do something along those lines. See, there's one problem which I frequently discussed with young people, that is that today there's an enormous pressure for the students and young postdocs to publish quickly, to publish in very good papers. As a consequence, they are forced, particularly the very brilliant ones, they're forced to join very good groups. And many, I say it now in quotation marks, get trapped into the work of those groups and continue along the same lines as these groups do. Some perform magnificent works, there's no question, But what is left out a little bit is the originality, is their own way of thinking, and the development of their own, how should I say, path into science. This I consider, I would say, it is kind of an intellectual inbreeding which is taking place and which needs to be at least considered by those who start their careers. And sometimes it's good to have already at an early stage free room. When I started my own career, for 3 years I selected the worst place which was possible for my training because I didn't get any advice. So I developed a number of crazy ideas during this period of time. Of course, the majority of them didn't work out at all, but in the end you found your own way to think a little bit, how should I say, not streamlined according to the present development of science. And in a way, retrospectively, I find that this period was for me very fruitful. I didn't think it at that time, but today I think it was a fruitful period.